The velvet silence of the ballroom was shattered by a thick rhythmic splash, the sound of $3,000 Burgundy hitting a white shirt like a fresh wound. All eyes turned toward the source. Veronica Whitmore stood there, her face twisted in a mask of jagged triumph, the empty crystal glass still tilted in her hand. Before her stood a silent waitress, her pristine white uniform now ruined by deep viscous streaks of dark red. "That's for forgetting your place, you invisible little nothing," Veronica hissed, her voice dripping with the poison of a woman who mistook kindness for weakness. The waitress didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Imani simply closed her eyes as the wine dripped onto the floor, her ebony skin glowing with an eerily calm radiance under the warm chandelier light. The crowd whispered, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the spark that would incinerate a corporate legacy. They saw a humiliated servant, but they had no idea she was Imani Clarke, and that her husband, the most immovable force in the global hotel industry, was watching her from the shadows with cold, calculated fury. Welcome to Status Karma. On this channel, we pull back the curtain on the world of the ultra-elite to see what happens when arrogance meets its match. Stay with me until the end of this first story, because the choice Isaiah Crowne makes is something you have to see to believe. It's a moment that redefined the city's power structure forever. As we launch this new journey together, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to become a founding member of our community. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Now let's go to the Skyline Sapphire, where a single glass of wine is about to cost a CO everything. The ballroom of the Skyline Sapphire was a galaxy of artificial stars, thousands of hand-cut crystals cascading from the ceiling, casting a fractured diamond-like glow on the city's most dangerous elite. It was the Crowne Group's Spring Gala, an arena where billion-dollar mergers were whispered over vintage champagne and reputations were dismantled between the main course and dessert. Men in bespoke Brioni suits, their wrists weighed down by the heavy gold of Patek Philippe watches, navigated a jungle of women molded into couture gowns that cost more than a suburban house. It was a world built on silk, ambition, and the absolute dismissal of those who served them. And tonight, Imani Clarke was just part of the scenery. Her uniform was a crisp, bright white button-up, clinical, sharp, and symbolic. A navy blue apron was tied firmly around her waist, her only defense against a world she secretly owned. To the predators in the room, she was just one of dozens of catering staff hired for the night. Efficient, silent, and utterly invisible. And that was exactly what she wanted. From her vantage point near a towering arrangement of white orchids and hydrangeas, her stormy gray eyes missed nothing. She tracked the subtle shifts in power, the predatory slant in the eyes of corporate sharks, and the whispered betrayals hidden behind polite smiles. This world was a game Imani knew how to play better than anyone, even from the wings. Her gaze finally settled on the couple holding court at the center of the room. Marcus Whitmore, a tech CEO aggressively courting the Crowne Foundation, wore his greed like a second skin. Beside him, clinging to his arm and practically vibrating with insecurity, was Veronica Whitmore. Veronica moved with the arrogant, volatile grace of someone who had never been told no. Her sleeveless blush-pink dress was a masterpiece of design, yet it couldn't soften the hardness in her eyes or the perpetual sneer on her perfectly painted lips. Imani had been watching them for nearly an hour. Marcus was a man desperate for a partnership that would save his failing empire, and Veronica was the loose cannon he couldn't control. They thought they were in a ballroom looking for an investor. They didn't realize they were in a laboratory, and the waitress was the one holding the results of their character test. The air inside the Skyline Sapphire was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the dry, metallic tang of old money. Under the relentless glow of the cascading chandeliers, the gala felt less like a charity event and more like a high-stakes auction where the item on the block was human dignity. Billion-dollar philanthropic pledges were traded like poker chips, whispered between sips of crude Classe d'Ambonne. Here, $1 million donation was simply the entry fee to buy silence for a corporate scandal, or to secure a seat next to the next governor. Men in razor-sharp Brioni suits leaned in close to one another, their laughter a practiced, hollow sound that never reached their eyes. Beside them, women draped in Elie Saab lace and weighted down by Bulgari diamonds glided across the marble, their movements as choreographed as a ballet and as cold as the ice in their glasses. This was a masterclass in performative empathy. A room full of people who would write a check for a distant crisis but wouldn't spare a glance for the person refilling their water. Imani Clarke moved through this sea of silk and ambition with the rhythmic precision of a ghost. In her stark white button-up and navy service apron, she was a blind spot in their field of vision. She was the staff, a utility, a moving piece of furniture designed to facilitate their comfort without ever occupying their thoughts. Her ebony skin was a cool, matte contrast to the shimmering, sweat-beaded faces of the tycoons she bypassed. She held her silver tray with a steady, unwavering hand, but her mind was a steel trap, snapping shut on every indiscretion. She saw the way a tech mogul surreptitiously slipped a business card to his rival's mistress. She heard the jagged edge in an heiress's voice as she mocked the gaudy jewelry of a newcomer. Most importantly, she watched the mask of sophistication slip. To the guests, the night was a celebration of their own benevolence. To Imani, it was a forensic audit of their souls. She navigated the perimeter of the ballroom, her stormy gray eyes scanning the crowd. She wasn't just serving drinks. She was mapping the rot within the empire she and Isaiah had built. Every dismissive wave of a hand, every thank you left unsaid was a data point. The cathedral of wealth was a beautiful, glittering lie, and Imani was the only one in the room who knew exactly how much it cost to keep the doors open, and how easily she could choose to close them. Beneath the starch of her collar, a small pulse-like hum in her earpiece reminded her that she was never truly alone, but the weight of her authority was hers to carry. In the corporate registry of the Crowne Hospitality Group, she was listed as the Director of Community Engagement, the strategic mind tasked with distributing the foundation's vast wealth. But tonight she was a data point. The memory of her meeting with Isaiah in his mahogany-paneled study 3 weeks ago flickered through her mind. He had been reviewing a list of potential grantees, men and women who spoke of uplifting the marginalized in glossy brochures. Imani had closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. If you want to know where our money belongs, Isaiah, don't look at their balance sheets. Look at how they treat the person who hands them a napkin. She had proposed the undercover mission not out of a desire for theater, but for truth. Isaiah, a man who valued authenticity above all else, had watched her with a mixture of amusement and profound respect before leaning back in his chair. The invisible architect, he had mused. Go on then. Show me who they really are when they think I'm not looking. Now the experiment was yielding its bitter results. Imani glided past a table of venture capitalists where a young woman, fresh to the scene, had thanked her with a genuine fleeting smile. Imani made a mental note to move her firm to the top of the potential list. But just as quickly the scale tipped toward the dark. She paused near the buffet as a real estate mogul reached for a glass without looking, his fingers brushing hers. Instead of an apology, he wiped his hand on his trouser leg with a look of visceral disgust, as if her touch had left a physical mark on his expensive suit. She moved on, her face a mask of professional neutrality, recording the performative philanthropists. There was the senator's wife, currently lecturing a group on the importance of living wages while snapping her fingers at a young busboy as if he were a disobedient hound. These were the people who used the Crowne name to burnish their own, while privately treating the foundation's heartbeat, its workers, as disposable. Imani's gaze sharpened. She wasn't just collecting names. She was gathering the kindling for a fire that would soon reorganize the city's hierarchy. Every sneer was an entry in her ledger. She was the ghost in their machine, the one who decided whose dreams would be funded, and whose legacies would be quietly dismantled. And as she adjusted her tray and turned toward the center of the room, she felt the first cold breeze of a storm approaching. High above the swirling currents of ego and silk, Isaiah Crowne sat in a room where the light was soft and the silence was absolute. His penthouse office, a sanctuary of dark oak and tempered glass, overlooked the ballroom like a watchtower. On a wall of high-definition monitors, the gala was reduced to a series of silent, shifting geometries, but his focus was singular. He ignored the mayors and the moguls. His eyes were locked on the woman in the white service shirt moving through the thick of the fray. Isaiah was a man who had built an empire on the philosophy that true power is felt, not heard. He was the reclusive sun around which this entire social solar system orbited, yet he preferred the shadows of the mezzanine. Groomed to a razor's edge, his silhouette was as sharp and immovable as a monolith. He watched Imani navigate the cathedral of wealth, with a pride that bordered on reverence. To the world, she was an employee tonight. To him, she was the only person in the room whose soul wasn't for sale. As he watched her, a low protective heat simmered beneath his calm exterior. Through the discreet cameras, he saw the way the guests looked through her, or worse, the way they looked at her when they thought she was beneath their station. He saw the real estate mogul's gesture of disgust, and the senator's wife's snapping fingers. Each slight against her felt like a hairline fracture in his own composure. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal black suit, his fingers interlocking as he leaned forward. He had known when he agreed to this test that Imani was more than capable of handling herself. Her intelligence was a surgical instrument, and her patience was her greatest weapon. Yet, seeing her endure the casual cruelty of the elite made his jaw tighten. He wasn't just a king surveying a kingdom. He was a guardian watching his greatest treasure walk through a den of vipers. He could have ended the charade with a single phone call, could have cleared the room and brought her up to the heights where she belonged. But he knew Imani. She wanted the truth, and the truth only revealed itself in the mud. He watched her turn toward the center of the ballroom, his gaze never wavering. The room below thought they were attending a party hosted by a man who wasn't there. They had no idea the Shadow King was watching every movement, every sneer and every insult. And more importantly, they had no idea that for every drop of disrespect they showed the woman in the apron, a debt was being recorded that they would soon be forced to pay in full. The heavy floral scent of the ballroom suddenly soured as Veronica Whitmore swept into the center of the room, trailing behind Marcus Whitmore like a parasitic vine clinging to a high-yield oak. Marcus, a man whose frantic ambition was poorly concealed by his tailored tuxedo, scanned the mezzanine for any sign of Isaiah Crowne, oblivious to the storm he had brought on his arm. Veronica, draped in a sleeveless blush-pink gown that clung to her with predatory precision, did not look for investors. She looked for targets. For Veronica, status was a zero-sum game. For her to feel high, someone else had to be made low. She moved with a jagged, artificial grace, her dark brown waves bouncing with a volatility that matched the hardness in her eyes. Every time a member of the catering staff passed, her lip curled. She treated the servers as if they were obstacles in her personal runway, intentionally shifting her weight to block their paths or handing off empty flutes without looking, letting the crystal clatter dangerously against their trays. Her attention snapped to Imani when she saw Marcus linger a second too long near the champagne station. Imani was mid-motion, her ebony skin a matte masterpiece against the stark white of her shirt, her posture so regal it made the high society women around her look like they were slouching. To a woman as hollow as Veronica, Imani's quiet dignity was an intolerable offense. Even in a service apron, Imani possessed a natural, unbought authority that Veronica's diamonds couldn't simulate. The insecurity ignited instantly. Veronica watched as Imani moved with an effortless, disciplined grace, noticing how the soft chandelier light caught the bridge of Imani's nose and her high, resolute cheekbones. In Veronica's twisted logic, a woman who looked like that, even in a uniform, was a threat to the fragile hold she had on Marcus's attention and her own social standing. To Veronica, the black waitress wasn't just staff. She was a mirror reflecting Veronica's own frantic inadequacy. "Marcus, stop looking at the help and find me a drink that isn't lukewarm," Veronica snapped, her voice cutting through the polite hum of the room like a jagged blade. She began to move toward the bar. Her eyes locked onto Imani with a poisonous focus. She didn't just want a drink. She wanted to extinguish the calm fire she saw in the waitress's eyes. She wanted to remind this woman of her place, unaware that she was about to walk into the very trap Imani and Isaiah had laid for the small-minded. Veronica's smile was thin and toxic as she closed the distance, the blush pink of her dress a soft lie masking the cruelty of her intent. The air between the two women suddenly grew thick, charged with the kind of friction that precedes a lightning strike. As Imani turned to replenish a tray of hors d'oeuvres, a flash of blush pink stepped sharply into her personal space. Veronica didn't just stand in her way. She planted herself like an obstacle, her body leaning forward, invading the professional distance Imani had maintained all night. "I've been watching you," Veronica began, her voice a low, vibrating hiss that cut beneath the swell of the orchestral music. Her eyes, sharp and restless with a cocktail of champagne and spite, raked over Imani's face. "The way you've been lingering around my partner. The way you look at him when you think no one is noticing." Imani remained as still as the marble pillars surrounding them, her chin level, her expression a mask of impenetrable calm. "Ma'am, I am simply ensuring the guests are served," she replied, her voice smooth and devoid of the tremor Veronica was clearly hunting for. "If there is a problem with the service, I would be happy to find a manager for you." "Oh, I know exactly what you're serving," Veronica snapped, her volume rising just enough to pull the attention of a nearby cluster of tech investors. Her mouth twisted into a jagged, ugly line. "I know your type. You think that because you have a pretty face and a little bit of poise, you can use this uniform to get close to men like Marcus. You see a man with his net worth and you think you can smile your way into his wallet, hoping for a ticket out of that apron." The accusation was thick with the rot of ancient, tired stereotypes, a calculated attempt to strip Imani of her humanity and reduce her to a caricature of greed. Marcus, catching the tail end of the scene, shuffled closer, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and cowardice. "Veronica, honey, leave it. She's just doing her job," he murmured, but he didn't reach for her arm, and he didn't tell her to stop. "She's hunting, Marcus. And I won't have it," Veronica cried, her rage mounting as she realized her words weren't breaking Imani's composure. The more professional Imani remained, the more volatile Veronica became. The socialite's hands were trembling now, the stem of her wine glass clutched so tightly it was a wonder the crystal didn't shatter. Around them, the cathedral of wealth began to go quiet. The polite hum of the gala was replaced by a voyeuristic silence as the city's elite turned their heads, their eyes gleaming with the predatory interest of people who enjoyed a public execution, provided it wasn't their own. Imani didn't blink. She met Veronica's gaze with a stormy gray fire that should have been a warning. But Veronica was too blinded by her own perceived superiority to see the trap closing around her. The silence that had settled over the ballroom was no longer polite. It was heavy and suffocating, a vacuum waiting for a spark. Veronica's face was a distorted map of unchecked malice, her golden undertones flushed a manic red. The lack of a reaction from the woman before her, the refusal of Imani to cower or beg, was the final insult to Veronica's fragile ego. With a sudden violent jerk of her arm, Veronica tilted her hand, and the dark, viscous weight of the vintage burgundy arched through the air. It happened in a terrifying slow-motion blur. The deep crimson liquid cascaded over Imani's head, soaking into the jet-black bun at the nape of her neck and blooming across the clinical whiteness of her shirt like a fresh, jagged wound. The wine was thick and cold, running in dark streaks down her face and neck, soaking into the navy apron that had been her shield. "Maybe this will teach you to stay in your place," Veronica hissed, her extended arm trembling with the force of her hatred. Her voice dropped to a jagged, guttural whisper, thick with a venom that reached back through centuries of prejudice. "You presumptuous little—" She didn't finish the word, but the slur hung in the air, unsaid yet unmistakable, vibrating with a cruelty that turned the stomachs of even the most cynical observers. A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral of wealth. Marcus made a pathetic, half-hearted reach for Veronica's shoulder. "A week now, darling, that's enough," fluttering from his lips, but he was a ghost trying to stop a hurricane. He stepped back almost immediately, terrified of being splattered by the fallout of his own partner's madness. Imani Clarke did not move. She did not raise a hand to wipe the stinging liquid from her eyes. She simply closed them. Standing at the center of the gilded room, she became a statue of ebony and stained white, her breath slow and rhythmic, her posture as upright and resolute as a queen on a battlefield. The dark burgundy wine continued to drip from her chin, splashing onto the polished marble floor with a rhythmic, wet sound that echoed louder than any scream. In that moment of absolute stillness, the power in the room shifted. The violence hadn't diminished her. It had stripped away the last of her invisibility. She was no longer a waitress. She was the emotional anchor of the entire gala. A woman whose silence was so profound it made Veronica's screaming aggression look like the desperate thrashing of a drowning animal. High above, the cameras caught the glisten of the wine against Imani's matte skin, and in the penthouse office the Shadow King stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a declaration of war. The atmosphere in the Skyline Sapphire Ballroom didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the lungs of the city's most powerful. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip-drop of vintage burgundy hitting the marble, a metronome marking the end of a social era. A few women in the front row pressed their hands to their mouths, their eyes darting toward the exits, while a group of venture capitalists stood paralyzed, the voyeuristic thrill of the spectacle warring with a dawning sense of profound discomfort. Some looked away, unable to meet the sight of the dark red liquid marring the clinical white of the uniform, while others leaned in, their phones hidden but ready, waiting for the staff to finally snap. Veronica stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest heaving, the empty wine glass still clutched in her hand like a trophy. She wore a look of manic triumph, her chin tilted up as she waited for the payoff. She expected Imani to burst into tears. She expected her to cover her face and flee toward the kitchens in a fit of sobbing hysterics. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing the invisible nothing finally broken. But Imani Clarke did not flee. Very slowly she opened her eyes. The stormy gray of her irises was not clouded by tears or widened by shock. They were as clear and sharp as a winter morning. She didn't blink away the wine that clung to her lashes. Instead, she let her gaze settle directly on Veronica. It was a look of devastating clinical calm, the way a scientist might observe a particularly volatile specimen in a petri dish. She didn't scream. She didn't even utter a word of protest. Her silence was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that began to turn Veronica's triumph into a sudden shivering doubt. "Well?" Veronica prompted, her voice cracking, the triumph beginning to leak out of her expression. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Say something. Cry. Get out of my sight." Imani said nothing. She simply stood her ground, her shoulders back and her head high, the dark wine streaks on her shirt looking less like a stain and more like a sash of honor. The absolute stillness of her posture made the frantic energy of the room seem small and pathetic. And then the heavy rhythmic thud of a single pair of footsteps echoed from the back of the hall. The crowd, sensing a shift in the gravity of the room, began to part. They didn't just step aside. They recoiled, moving with a sudden desperate urgency to clear a path. A hush that was even deeper, even more terrifying than before, swept through the ballroom. The Red Sea of the elite opened, and through the gap, a figure emerged from the shadows of the mezzanine, moving with the slow, inevitable power of a tide coming in to swallow the shore. The parting of the crowd was not a polite gesture. It was a visceral reaction to the sudden presence of a predator. Isaiah Crowne moved through the center of the skyline sapphire with a stride that was slow, rhythmic, and heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. His charcoal black suit seemed to absorb the light of the chandeliers, making him a solid, immovable shadow in a room of flickering, nervous sparks. The whispers died in throats. The socialites who had been smirking seconds ago now stood frozen, their champagne flutes trembling, as the man they had spent all night trying to catch a glimpse of finally walked among them. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the disgraced tech moguls or the gaping heiresses. His gaze was a laser, fixed solely on the woman standing at the epicenter of the mess. Isaiah reached the middle of the floor, and did not stop until he was inches from Imani. He did not stand beside her as a peer, nor did he stand in front of her to hide the shame. Instead, he moved directly behind her. He stepped into her personal space, his tall, powerful frame creating a vertical line of dominance that shadowed her own. It was a posture of absolute protection, a silent declaration that she was his, and that to touch her was to strike at the very foundation of the building they stood in. Imani felt the warmth of his presence at her back, a stark contrast to the cold, sticky wine that still dripped from her hair. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The shift in the room's oxygen told her everything. Isaiah's hands remained clasped in front of him, his fingers interlocked in a gesture of deceptive restraint. His face was a mask of marble, his jaw set with the kind of precision that signaled a man who had already decided how the night would end. While his expression remained professionally calm, his eyes were twin depths of cold Arctic fury. They searched Imani's face, tracing the dark burgundy streaks on her matte skin with a gaze that promised a reckoning far more permanent than a dry cleaning bill. He ignored Veronica entirely, treating the woman in the blush pink dress as if she were a piece of discarded trash on a sidewalk. For the moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. In the middle of his empire, beneath the crystals and the stars, there was only the king and the woman he was about to crown. The silence was so profound that the soft sound of Isaiah's steady breathing felt like the only thing keeping the room from collapsing. The silence in the room was so brittle it felt as though the slightest breath would shatter the crystal cascading from the ceiling. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he finally spoke, his tone was a low, resonant baritone that carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom, cutting through the stagnant air like a gavel. "I hope everyone has enjoyed the service tonight," Isaiah said, his eyes finally shifting to scan the room, though his body remained a protective shadow behind Imani. "Because you have been served by the very woman who designed this evening. The woman who vets your foundations, who signs your grants, and who decided which of you were worthy of an invitation to this hotel." A wave of audible, jagged breath swept through the crowd. Veronica's hand dropped, the empty wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble with a sharp, lonely crack. "This is not a waitress," Isaiah continued, his voice hardening into something lethal. "This is Imani Clarke. She is the director of community engagement for the Crowne Group and the primary architect of the Skyline Sapphire's mission. She is my wife, and she is the most powerful person in this room." The shock was physical. It rippled through the tech moguls and socialites like a tremor, turning faces pale and making knees weak. The invisible nothing they had watched being humiliated was the gatekeeper to their fortunes. The person they had treated as scenery was the one who held their corporate lives in her hands. Isaiah reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a slim, shimmering platinum card. It caught the light of the chandeliers, flashing with a cold metallic brilliance. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached around Imani and placed the master key card into her wine-stained hand. His fingers lingered against hers, a silent tether of strength. "Imani," he whispered, though the entire room heard him. "This hotel is now under your absolute authority. Every decision made within these walls, every guest on the register, and every policy going forward is yours to dictate. You wanted to see who they were in the dark. Now you get to decide who is allowed to stay in the light." The symbolism was a strike to the heart of the elite. He wasn't just defending her honor. He was handing her the scepter of the kingdom. As Imani's fingers closed around the cold platinum, her stormy gray eyes finally shifted toward Veronica. The waitress was gone. The director was gone. In her place stood a queen who had been given the keys to her own empire, and the first item on her agenda was a long overdue cleaning. The heavy silence that followed the handoff of the platinum key was broken only by the sound of Isaiah Crowne's gaze shifting. It was a slow mechanical movement that finally landed on Veronica and Marcus. The heat of his protectiveness had transformed into a sub-zero chill. Veronica, stripped of her arrogance, looked suddenly small in her blush-pink gown, her complexion ashen against the glittering backdrop of the room she no longer belonged in. The Crowne Foundation was built on a singular premise, Isaiah began, his voice dropping to a level that was terrifyingly quiet. "We invest in the future of human dignity. We fund those who build up, not those who tear down." He took a single step toward Marcus, who looked as though he wanted to dissolve into the marble floor. "Your company, Whitmore Tech, was at the top of our investment list this morning. You came here seeking a partnership to save your legacy." Isaiah paused, letting the weight of that reality crush the air out of Marcus's lungs. "But the woman you chose to stand beside just showed us the true culture of your leadership. In this empire, we do not partner with people who treat service as a sign of inferiority. We do not fund those who confuse cruelty with status." He turned his eyes back to Veronica, who was trembling, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "You're banned," Isaiah said, the word falling like a guillotine blade. "From this property. From every Crowne hotel, resort, and club worldwide. From this moment on, your names are blacklisted from any foundation consideration, any corporate merger, and any social event under our banner. Permanently." The finality of it was a social death sentence. In an industry where the Crowne name was the gold standard, being cast out was equivalent to professional bankruptcy. "Security," Isaiah called out, not raising his voice, yet the word commanded an immediate response. For men in charcoal suits, Imani's team, who had been waiting in the wings, materialized from the edges of the room. They didn't move with the roughness of bouncers, but with the surgical precision of executors. "Escort Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore to the curb," Isaiah commanded, "and ensure they do not take so much as a cocktail napkin of Crowne property with them." The crowd of hundreds watched in a state of paralyzed fascination as the security team stepped in. There was no physical struggle, but the sight of Marcus being led away by his elbows and Veronica stumbling behind him, her loose waves disheveled and her head down, was the ultimate execution. As they were marched toward the grand mahogany doors, the elite guests, the same ones who had whispered moments before, now turned their backs, effectively erasing the couple from existence before they even hit the sidewalk. The doors closed with a heavy final thud, leaving the ballroom in a state of absolute purified stillness. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors served as the final punctuation to an era of silence. As the room began to exhale in a low, frantic murmur of redirected gossip, Isaiah turned fully toward Imani. The Arctic fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze so tender it felt like a private sanctuary in the middle of the crowded floor. Without a word, he unbuttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy, warm fabric, scented with sandalwood and the familiar, grounding presence of him, covered the jagged burgundy stain on her white shirt. It was more than a gesture of modesty, it was a physical shielding, a king's mantle offered to his queen. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear as the world around them blurred into insignificance. "You've been hiding your light in the service of an experiment, Imani," he whispered, his hand lingering on the lapel of the jacket now resting on her frame. "I let you walk through the mud because you asked to, but I have been waiting for the moment you finally claimed the throne you built. Tonight the invisibility ends. We are finished with the shadows." The transition from the invisible architect to the public face of the Crown Empire was as swift as a tidal wave. In the weeks that followed, the video of the Burgundy baptism, captured by a dozen hidden but curious phones, went viral, igniting a global conversation about class, dignity, and the arrogance of the elite. Veronica Whitmore was branded the Wine Karen, her name becoming a permanent synonym for entitled cruelty. She vanished from the social register, her invitations drying up overnight, while Marcus Whitmore's tech empire crumbled as investors scrambled to distance themselves from his toxic brand. Imani, however, found herself thrust into a blinding spotlight she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Her face, once a secret known only to the boardroom, was now on every morning show and news magazine. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was a national icon of poise and resilience. The transition was jarring. She struggled with the loss of her cherished anonymity, the ability to walk through her own hotels without being swarmed by cameras or requests for statements. But in the quiet hours of the night, back in the sanctuary of the penthouse, Isaiah remained her anchor. He stood behind her as she prepared for interviews, his hands on her shoulders, reminding her that while the world now saw her light, he was the only one who truly knew the fire that fueled it. She was no longer just his secret wife or a silent director. She was a rising force, and as she looked at her reflection, no longer in a service apron, but in the sharp lines of a leader, she realized the stain had not ruined her. It had merely forced the world to finally see her. 3 months later, the ballroom of the Skyline Sapphire had been scrubbed of its ghosts, but the memory of that night remained as a foundational stone. The chandeliers still cascaded like frozen stars, but the air no longer felt heavy with the scent of predatory ambition. It felt like a beginning. Imani Clarke stood at the center of the podium, the very spot where she had once been doused in liquid hatred. The transformation was absolute. She was no longer wearing the clinical white of a servant. Instead, she wore a custom-tailored suit in a deep, commanding burgundy. It was a deliberate reclamation of the color that was meant to shame her. A sartorial declaration that what was intended as a stain had become her signature. Her ebony skin glowed with a matte finish that needed no shield, and her hair, still pulled into a precise bun, felt like a crown of discipline rather than a badge of service. Before a sea of flashing lenses and eager journalists, Imani announced the launch of the Elevation Initiative. It was a $100 million commitment designed to shatter the very glass ceilings she had spent her career navigating. The program didn't just offer charity, it offered a pipeline. It established leadership academies for hospitality staff, education partnerships that turned busboys into branch managers, and a rigorous set of dignity standards that made respect a mandatory condition of any Crown contract. In the front row, Isaiah Crowne sat with his hands clasped, his expression one of quiet, unshakable pride. He was no longer a shadow king watching from a penthouse monitor. He was a husband standing in the light of his wife's brilliance. He didn't need to lead the room. He was content to follow her direction. As the press conference drew to a close, Imani leaned toward the microphone, her stormy gray eyes scanning the room with the same sharp intelligence that had once mapped its rot. 3 months ago, in this very room, someone tried to make me invisible, she said, her voice steady and resonant. They believed that by staining my clothes, they could strip away my worth. Instead, they forced me into the light. And now, I am using that light to illuminate the pathways for everyone who has ever been told that their service makes them unworthy of power. In this empire, we do not just serve, we lead. As the room erupted into applause, Imani raised the platinum master key card, the metal catching the light and throwing a brilliant crown-like reflection against the wall. The cameras flashed in a rhythmic, blinding staccato, capturing the final image of the invisible architect fully revealed. Isaiah stood and walked toward the stage, stepping into the frame beside her. The man who once ruled from the shadows had finally found a queen worth standing in the light for, and together, they looked out over a kingdom that was finally, truly, theirs. The story of Imani and Isaiah Crowne serves as a powerful reminder. True status isn't found in the labels we wear or the titles we hold, but in how we treat those we think can do nothing for us. Veronica and Marcus believed that their wealth gave them the right to treat others as invisible. They mistook Imani's silence for weakness and her service for insignificance. But in the world of status karma, your character is the only currency that truly matters. When you treat someone like the help, you might just be insulting the person who holds the keys to your future. Power can build a cathedral, but only integrity can keep you inside it. If you enjoyed seeing justice served in the halls of the Skyline Sapphire, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Status Karma. By joining our community today, you're helping us bring more of these incredible stories of accountability and triumph to life. Don't forget to follow us and turn on that notification bell, so you never miss a moment where the elite meet their match. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Imani's shoes? I'm Status Karma, and remember, no matter how high the status, karma is always watching. We'll see you in the next story.